Hi everyone, this is the second batch of tea that I'm cooking this year. I wanted to shoot the first batch that I just cooked an hour ago, but the neighbor was hammering nails in his walls, so it was a bit obnoxious to shoot a video. So now we're just a bit later in the evening, it must be around 11 o'clock, and I'm here with my second batch of the year. First batch was some ancient tea garden leaves from a garden just below our house, picked by our cousin Yechen, and we had like 15 kilo of this material, so I processed it in one batch, so it was quite a heavy batch. It took me 25 minutes to cook it, which is a lot for spring tea. And now I'm just cooking the leaves from our garden, the ancient tea garden that we own on the plateau on Tapingjiang, and which is called Nobu Wan. My mother-in-law went on her own to pick this tea, and she got 18 kilo of this tea. So that will be two batches of average weight, which is quite comfortable. Usually in spring I prefer to cook smaller batches, which means like 8 to 9 kilo, while in autumn I will rather enjoy having more steam in the batch and therefore use more leaves. So I will rather use maybe 10 kilo per batch. But anyway, first I would like to share my impressions of going back to China after 2 months in Europe. Or no, I would rather first share my impressions of going back to Europe after having stayed 5 years in China. So it happened like 2 months ago. I had the chance to be able to go to Europe after the end of the COVID policy and lots of administrative trouble, and it was quite a shock in Europe because I felt everything felt tiny in Europe. Like the streets are more narrow than in China. The ceilings are smaller, lower. The cars are smaller. The buildings are smaller. So it's quite interesting because in 5 years in China I had completely lost that sense of the scale of things. Also, something I noticed is that we say that there's a lot of people in China, but maybe not so many in Yunnan, because when I got back to Europe, everywhere felt very crowded. Like in Europe, the streets are very narrow, especially like the pedestrian walkways, and you always feel like you bump into people, or you have to make yourself tiny to go into some places. And usually the cities have a lot of fences, lots of obstacles that you have to navigate through. So it's quite complicated. And it's something that kept pursuing me while I was staying and traveling in Europe. It's complicated in Europe. And by this I mean that maybe the societies there are more normative than in China. For example, if you want to go to a nice restaurant in Europe, you have to book a table. This is something that I've never done in my life. And in China, I don't know, in China there's always room, or you just queue for 10 minutes and then you will have room in the restaurant. If you want to find a parking spot for your car in a big city, you need to maybe book a parking spot with an app or something like that. This is something that is beyond my now more Chinese-like understanding of life. At least in Yunnan, we really don't plan our life that far ahead. And I think booking a table would be a hard task for people, because 10 minutes before going to lunch, typically you don't know where you're going to go. And the life works like this here. So it was really interesting to be confronted to that European conformity, I would say. And it's interesting because by going back to China, actually, I would say that the day-to-day life is more free when you're in China. You have less obstacles like this in your day-to-day life. Now, of course, I'm saying this probably because now I'm much more used to the Chinese lifestyle than the European lifestyle. And you could argue that while I was in Europe, I was traveling constantly, so it always takes some time to get accustomed to a new place. And of course, it will be less convenient than staying where you're used to stay. But the second thing about going back to Europe is nostalgia. Unlike China, Europe doesn't change, or at least France doesn't change, and my hometown or Paris or all these places I've been to, they are exactly the same as when I left them. While if you were to leave China for 5 years, many places you wouldn't recognize. Actually, I could say that in 2 months, Pu'er city has changed more than my hometown in France in 5 years. You know, by the time I came back here, I found that they had built some new roads, or you had deviations, things like that. And even in Jingmai. So it's also quite interesting to see that that perspective. Like it seems in Europe, people like when things are well organized, and also when they don't change that much. You can see that in Europe there tends to be a lot of trouble that when governments want to change things. You can see that with the current troubles in France, for example, about changes in the pension system. And it seems in China people are just used to living in a constantly changing environment, and so this is just why maybe they don't make that many plans. And I think it's a perspective that that might fit maybe some personalities better than others. And I must say I'm rather more accustomed to the Chinese way in this perspective. And I say China, but I think it's the same in most of like Southeast Asia. And so, for example, sometimes people ask me like, do I plan on making this production this year, this kind of things? And you must know that I don't really make plans. Okay, I work with my heart, and well, today I didn't expect to have that many good leaves in my wok, and I'm really grateful because I have 3 batches of pretty good material. And we'll see tomorrow what we can get. We'll probably get another batch of Nogu 1. And there will be this journalist team. So now their shooting team will come. So probably they will want to shoot us picking the tea in the tea gardens and then making tea in the factory. I'm quite used to doing this because every season basically we have journalists coming here for some documentaries. And I always take these opportunities not really for personal business advancement, because so far it's never really given us anything, but just in an effort to maybe spread the tea culture, or at least give a message to whatever audience they have in terms of what good tea is. And well, that's when I try to talk about the terroir. But yeah, to come back on Europe, I was also, it was interesting to look at the house design and how sturdy things are in Europe compared to China. You know, because in China, let's say you have a tap, you wouldn't expect your tap to last more than 5 years maybe. Or you know, any kind of furniture is very short-lived in China. While actually in Europe, So when I just arrived in Europe, like getting off from the plane into the airport, it felt a bit like a third world country. I mean, that's the thought that crossed my mind when I arrived in the airport in Rome, simply because it lacked of all the lights and the bells and whistles that an Asian airport would have. It was very dark. Then I arrived in a hotel room, very nice hotel room, and then I noticed that the window frames, they looked like they were maybe 30 years old. So at the first look you say, why would they keep something that old? Well, because they make them well, they make them sturdy, while in China usually everything you build is planned for maybe 5 to 10 years. So again, another difference in perspective. Now I think the most enjoyable side of doing like this in Europe, of keeping some traditions and keeping some things around, some old stones, is that you can have nostalgia, or at least you can have nostalgia more easily, because the things are at the same place as they were before. And when I arrived in my hometown, I went to my parents' house, who were very happy to meet me, especially since I hadn't told them anything about my traveling plans. And just on the next day, while I was still jet lagged, I would wake up at maybe 5 in the morning, when it was very, very dark and cold in the house. And I just started smelling each place. So I opened my old closet in my bedroom and started to smell. And that smell, it reminded me so many things, my high school years. It just smelled quite the same. Then I opened my tea closet and I smelled, and it reminded me of that dry storage, that poor tea dry storage smell that I got so accustomed to when I was doing my studies in Europe, and that I hadn't experienced in a long time. And then I started to notice that each room in your house has a specific smell, which, by the way, might be something that could influence the storage of your pu'er tea cakes. But I will talk about pu'er tea storage in a later video. But anyway, I was very happy about this, and I find that with everything changing in China, it can be a bit harder to have nostalgia, or at least you get a more distant views, because the old stones, the old stuff is not there anymore. Maybe I'm just being a bit too materialistic here. That's why maybe in China the nostalgia would better go through friends, through people, through ideas, than through stuff. Interestingly, the Chinese care a lot about their history, but they don't really preserve it. And well, it's quite interesting to notice that if you compare it to Europe. It seems there's something more spiritual about the concept of history in China. Okay, so I'm talking, and while I'm talking, my tea keeps cooking, and now the fire is a bit hot, so I'm going to take one out, trying not to burn my water pipe there, and it will be fine. So you see, what's enjoyable in the spring is that the leaves are very forgiving, or at least they are meant to be cooked in a wok. The spring leaves are really suitable for wok cooking. They are very, it's a joy, it's a joy. They feel moist, like the touch is amazing, really. You get a feel. And unlike autumn leaves, which it seems they don't really want to be cooked, those autumn leaves. So you have to kind of force them to be cooked with steam and stuff. But the spring leaves cook so well. And yeah, so I want to finish that chapter on nostalgia by saying that while I got very nostalgic of going back to my bedroom in my parents' house, I also just got that same feeling when I came back into my tea factory today, because you get your habits in the tea factory, and I haven't cooked tea in 6 months, and I have my brush and my little bucket to skim the water. I have those little tools which are in their spot, ready to serve their purpose. And it is something very enjoyable. And it's also, I think, a kind of nostalgia that you can experience just in a matter of months. It's just like a routine, you could say. So it's been 6 months since I haven't cooked tea in a wok, but it just feels like I just did that yesterday, because I've done that so much, and every time you could say it's kind of the same, or at least you have the same ritual. And in that way, it just feels like meeting a really good friend that you haven't met in 5 years, for example, and you don't really talk about what you've been doing and things. You just follow up with the conversation that you just had 5 years ago, without any politeness or introductions of like random people that you haven't met in 5 years. You just start joking or telling the same stories, and so maybe that's why we should cherish rituals and friends. We have something in common after all. And now I think it's about time to end this first session, because the leaves are actually well cooked now. It hasn't been a very long session, but it's fine. Let's do this. I'm just gonna give them a little straightening like this to make them more easily rollable and in a good shape. And I'm going to extract them from the wok. So I hope you enjoyed this directionless rambling in a pure Chinese way, not planned at all, totally improvised. And well, I hope you have a good evening or a good tea, and see you next time. Bye bye.